3 weeks. That was how long Sarah had been queen. And already she had learned the particular silence that precedes a verdict. She recognized it now the way she recognized the smell of snow before it fell. A pressing, breathless quality to the air that made the back of her neck prickle, even when nothing visible had changed. She was standing outside the council antechamber, her fingers still curved around the tray she'd been sent to retrieve before the evening's closed session, when she heard Callum's voice through the oak-paneled door, low, measured, the voice he used when he had already decided something, and was merely announcing the decision to men who would agree with him. "The arrangement needs to change," he said. "She isn't fit for what's coming." Sarah did not drop the tray. She was prouder of that, afterward, than she had any right to be. She stood in the corridor, with the silver handles biting into her palms. And she listened to the man she had married 3 weeks ago explain to his counsel, in that same measured voice, that she would need to be replaced. She did not hear the rest. Or rather, she heard it, the low agreements, the careful legal language, the phrase provisional bonding period, used in the same tone one used to discuss livestock contracts. But she did not absorb it. What she absorbed was simpler and more total. She had known this would happen. She had believed, briefly, foolishly, that it wouldn't. That was the thing about hope. It didn't announce itself. It simply moved in while you were occupied with surviving, arranged its furniture quietly in the corners of your chest, and then left all at once like a tide going out, taking the floor with it. She set the tray down on the side table in the corridor. She set it down carefully, so it did not make a sound. Then she went upstairs to pack. She had not been raised in the Callum pack. That was the first thing every wolf in the Aldenmark territory knew about her, though they expressed it in a dozen careful ways. She was from the western reaches. She was Bramblefield-born. She had come to them through the treaty and not through blood. What they meant always was that she was not quite real to them, not quite solid. She was a political object that had arrived speaking their language and wearing their colors, and they had watched her from a careful distance to see if she would stay in the shape they required. She had been shaped by necessity her entire life. She knew how to do it. What she had not anticipated was that the shaping would eventually require her to disappear entirely. Her room was large and impersonal, in the way that rooms assigned to political wives tended to be, beautiful objects chosen by someone else. A window that faced the courtyard, so she could be observed going in and out. A wardrobe full of gowns in the Aldenmark green and gold that she had never chosen. She moved through it quickly, efficiently, pulling only what was hers. A traveling bag, the heavy wool one, that had been her mother's, which she'd brought across 2 mountain passes before she ever set foot in this castle. 2 changes of clothing, practical ones she'd kept, at the bottom of the wardrobe, because the council liaison had hinted, once, that practical clothing was unbecoming of her station. Her mother's compass, scratched silver, which still pointed true. A folded letter from her sister that she had read so many times the creases had gone soft. She was at the door before she stopped. The bond pulled at her, and she hated it for that. 3 weeks, and it had already put down roots she hadn't consented to. A warm, low pressure in the center of her chest that was not quite pain and not quite warmth, and was, she understood with cold clarity, the fated mate recognition that the old stories talked about in reverent tones. The stories never mentioned that it could be one-sided. They never mentioned that you could be someone's fated mate and still be replaceable. She pressed one hand flat against the door frame, let the pull stretch and ache. Then she walked through it. The castle had 17 separate exits. She'd memorized them in the first week, not because she'd planned to flee, but because she was Bramblefield-born, and Bramblefield wolves memorized exits the way other wolves memorized titles. The one she chose now led out behind the stables, into the long shadow of the eastern wall, where the torches were spaced farther apart, and the guards changed rotation on the hour. She went between rotations. Her boots were quiet on the stone. The night was cold and smelled of pine resin and distant water, and she moved through it like someone who had always known she would be moving through it. Not running, because running left a scent trail that read as prey, but walking with purpose, with direction, as if she were going somewhere she had every right to go, which she was. She had every right to go anywhere she chose. That was the part of herself she had refused to negotiate away, even in the treaty, even in the ceremony, even when the council liaison had looked at the terms she'd requested and pursed his thin lips. She had freedom of movement, It was in writing, ironclad, witnessed. They had thought it a harmless concession. She had thought of it as the most important thing in the room. She followed the river road south for 3 hours before she let herself think about where she was actually going. The moon was past its midpoint, softening from white to the particular warm ivory that meant the hours before dawn. And Sarah was calculating distances the way she always calculated distances, in terms of terrain, weather, and what her body could reasonably carry. She was fit, she was practiced. She was also wearing court shoes that had not been designed for unpaved roads, a fact her feet were beginning to report with some urgency. She stopped at the fork, where the river road split, east toward the trade routes, north into the high territory that technically belonged to no pack. She stood there with her compass open in her palm and let herself be still for exactly 1 minute. She wanted to go east. East was familiar, was the direction she associated with rescue and with her sister's letter. But east was also the direction they would expect. And they would follow, because she was still provisionally bonded to their king, and a provisionally bonded queen who walked out in the night was not just a personal matter. She was a political incident. She took the North Road. The high territory was called the Greywood on the old maps, and on the council's newer maps it was simply left blank. A deliberate blankness that was its own kind of statement, meaning unclaimed, meaning unincorporated, meaning we have chosen not to look there. It stretched for perhaps 60 miles between the southern packs and the distant northern settlements. And it was the sort of wilderness that looked, from a distance, simply like trees. Up close, it was something else, something older. The pines here were enormous, their trunks wider than she could reach around, their canopy so dense that the forest floor was dry, even though she'd been hearing rain at her back for the last 2 hours. She walked until her court shoes gave out entirely, the right one first, the sole peeling loose like a judgment. And then she walked in her stockings until she found a fallen tree wide enough to sit on, and sat. The bond pulled. She put her hand on her sternum and pressed, which did nothing useful but gave her something to push against. The pressure was cleaner now, farther from the castle, which told her something uncomfortable about how close she'd been to accepting it, to letting it settle, to deciding that the warm weight in her chest was close enough to the truth. "You are not replaceable," she said to the dark trees quietly. To hear someone say it, even if it was only herself. The trees did not argue. She was tightening a strip of fabric around her right foot, improvising something between a sock and a slipper, from the hem of her spare shirt, when she heard it. Not footsteps, nothing so obvious as footsteps. It was more like a shift in the quality of the silence. An attention turning toward her from the darkness between the trees, specific and deliberate. She finished the knot before she looked up. Looking up too quickly was another thing they'd tried to out of her in the first week. The instinct toward direct eye contact that read as challenge among the Aldenmark wolves. And she'd kept it only because it was true to her nature. And she had decided that was the category of things she would not surrender. But she looked up slowly, on her own terms. He was standing at the edge of the tree shadow, perhaps 10 feet away. She had not heard him approach. He was very still in the way that large things were sometimes still. Not absence of motion, but complete deliberate control of it. A quality she associated with apex predators and with men who had learned at some expense to contain themselves. He was not from the Aldenmark pack. She could tell that, immediately. He wore no green and gold, carried no pack emblem that she could see. And his scent, when the air shifted between them, was nothing like the slightly acidic copper undertone that the Aldenmark wolves carried. He smelled of cedarwood and deep water, and something mineral she couldn't immediately name. And under all of it, something else. Something that made the pressure in her chest shift, and then go strange and quiet in a way that was entirely new. "You're bleeding," he said. Not an accusation, not even particularly concerned. A simple statement of fact offered in a deep, even voice that she catalogued automatically as belonging to someone who was not in the habit of raising it. She looked down at her improvised foot binding. He was right. The stockings had been thin, and the forest floor had not been forgiving. "Marginally," she said. "I've made allowances." A pause. He was looking at her foot, not her face, which was either very polite or very tactical. "Where are you trying to get to?" he said. "North," she said. "There's nothing north of here for another 40 miles. I'm aware of that. You're going to get frostbite before dawn." She looked up at him more directly now, because she had decided he was not a threat, not that kind of threat. though she was keeping the assessment provisional. He was large, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with a face that looked like it had been arranged by someone more interested in structure than in symmetry. His jaw was too strong, his nose slightly crooked, his eyes. And this was the part she noted and filed carefully. A dark amber that caught the moonlight in a way that suggested something older than the color itself. "Are you going to offer me shoes?" she said. Something shifted very slightly at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the shadow of one. "I was going to offer you shelter," he said. "There's a cabin, about a mile east. I've just spent 3 hours walking south to avoid going east." "I know," he said. "You can go back to going north in the morning, when your feet aren't bleeding." She looked at him for a long moment. The pressure in her chest had not resolved. It had simply changed in character, settling into something lower and more fundamental. The way barometric pressure settled before a major weather event. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She filed it next to his eyes and moved on. "What's your name?" she said. "Evander," he said. "Evander what?" "Just Evander out here." He said it without evasion, which was itself a kind of information. Someone who had learned to be unnamed in a particular way, which meant they had been named too loudly somewhere else. She stood, tested her weight on the improvised bandaging, found it tolerable. "I'm Sarah," she said. "I know," he said. She went still. "Do you?" "I know you're not from Aldenmark," he said carefully. "You move differently. That's all." He turned and began walking east without waiting for her to follow or not follow, which was the right move, she thought. No pressure, no false courtesy, simply the direction of the cabin laid out like an option in the air. She followed, because her feet were bleeding and she was not stupid, and because the pressure in her chest moved in the direction he moved, like a compass finding north. The cabin was exactly what he'd said. A mile east, unremarkable from the outside, a low structure of pine log and fieldstone, with firelight showing at the window. She registered two things simultaneously as she stepped through the door. The warmth, which hit her like something physical, and the quality of the interior. It was not a rough camp. The furniture was heavy and well made, the fireplace large and properly laid, the shelves along the near wall, holding both practical goods and less practically, several stacks of books. Someone lived here with intention. "Sit," he said, not looking at her, moving to a cabinet by the far wall. "I'll get something for your feet." She sat on the bench near the fire, untied her makeshift bandaging, and examined the damage with the same clinical attention she gave to most problems. 2 small cuts on the right foot, 1 longer abrasion on the left that had bled more than she'd realized. Her stockings were past saving. He came back with clean cloth, a bowl of warm water, and a small tin that turned out to contain a herbal salve that smelled of arnica and something resinous. He set these things on the floor at her feet, and then looked at her with a question that he didn't articulate. "I can do it myself," she said. "Yes," he said. He didn't move away, waited. She began cleaning her own feet, methodically. And the silence between them was the kind of silence she had almost forgotten existed. Comfortable not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of them required the other to fill it. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the rain, she'd been hearing at her back, finally arrived, hitting the roof in a long, even pour. "You didn't ask why I'm in the Greywood in court shoes in the middle of the night," she said after a while. "No," he said. "Most people would ask." "Most people would," he agreed. He was sitting across the fire from her, now, one arm resting on his knee, watching the flames the way people watched fires when they had things they were not saying. The amber of his eyes was deeper in the firelight, less gold, more ancient. "You'll tell me if you want to. Or you won't." She applied the salve. The arnica stung, then eased. "I heard my husband tell his counsel he was going to replace me," she said. She had not planned to say it. It arrived fully formed from wherever she'd been keeping it. "I left before he could explain or deny it. I don't know which would have been worse." Evander said nothing for a moment. Then, "What would explain it? Replacing you?" "I don't know," she said. "That's the part I can't." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "It doesn't matter what explains it." The thing was said. The intention was there. Intentions are information. "They are," he said quietly. And something in the way he said it made her think he was speaking from a long, specific experience of that particular truth. She finished wrapping her feet in the clean cloth. The fire was warm. The rain was steady. She was exhausted in the way that followed sustained alertness, the crash that came when you had finally reached somewhere that was, at least provisionally, not dangerous. "I'm not going back," she said. It was the first time she'd said it directly, and it clarified something in her chest, settled the bond's pressure to a kind of steady ache she could live beside, regardless of what the explanation is. "I'm not going back to a place where my husband talks about my replacement with his counsel before he talks about it with me." Evander was quiet for a moment that was not uncomfortable. Then he said, "The room to the left is empty. There are boots in the chest by the door. Probably too large, but better than what you have. I'll see what I can find for your feet in the morning." She looked at him across the firelight. "Why?" she said, not suspiciously but genuinely. She was not in the habit of accepting help without understanding its terms. He met her eyes. His gaze was steady in a way that was not aggressive, simply fully present, like something that had stopped performing and simply was. "Because it's raining," he said, "and you need somewhere to sleep." She held his gaze for another moment, reading it for the fine print that she had learned to look for in every offer she'd ever received. She found nothing she recognized as a trap, which was itself unusual enough to notice. "Good night, Evander," she said. "Good night," he said, and went back to watching the fire as if she'd always been there. And her leaving the room was simply the next quiet thing that happened. She slept, which surprised her. She had not expected to sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of wood being split outside. A steady, unhurried rhythm that she lay listening to for several minutes before she placed it. It was not aggressive wood splitting, not the kind that meant temper or frustration. It was rhythmic in the way of a person who had done something enough times that it had become meditative. Useful and mindless at once, a way of being present in the body, without requiring the mind to be present too. She lay in the narrow bed in the left room and catalogued what she knew. She was in the Greywood, an unclaimed territory. She was in the cabin of a man named Evander, who carried no pack markings and had a scent she couldn't categorize, and eyes the color of old amber. He had offered her shelter and asked her for nothing. She was still provisionally bonded to Callum, which meant that somewhere in the castle she'd left behind, someone had noticed her absence, and the question was not whether they were looking for her, but how energetically, and in which direction. The boots in the chest by the door were, as advertised, too large. She laced them tightly and they were passable, which told her something about the man who'd thought to mention them. Practical, specific. Not given to either false reassurance or unnecessary alarm. She found him outside. He was exactly where the sounds had placed him. Behind the cabin, at a splitting block, working through a cord of pine with a long-handled axe. He saw her when she came around the corner and stopped immediately. Not with the deliberateness of someone ending a task, but with the clean stop of someone who had simply shifted their attention. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "I saw," she said. "Thank you." She looked at the woodpile. "How long have you been living out here?" 4 years on and off," he said. He set the axe against the block. "Alone?" "Mostly." She had questions she was carefully not asking, and she suspected he knew it, and she suspected he was extending her the same courtesy she'd extended him the night before. No pressure. Simply the information laid out in the air as an option. "I need to get to the northern settlements," she said. "Is there a route that doesn't require going back south?" "There's a ridge road," he said. "Takes an extra day, but it stays in the Greywood." "Can you tell me where it is?" He looked at her for a moment, the amber gaze steady. "I can show you," he said, "if you're not leaving today." She was not leaving today. Her feet, however wrapped and booted, were not leaving Tade feet. She knew it, and she understood that he knew it without saying it as a constraint. She appreciated that. She was not accustomed to appreciating things, having learned a long time ago that appreciation was the beginning of a dependency. But she was making an allowance. "Not today," she said. He nodded, picked up the axe again. She went inside to drink the coffee, which was strong and black, and tasted like it had been made by someone who took the making of coffee seriously. And she sat at the heavy table by the window and looked out at the pine forest, and allowed herself to simply be in one place for a little while. She spent the day in small acts of recovery, cleaning her feet, eating the spare, well-made food he produced without ceremony, and reading, with his permission, from the shelves of books she'd noticed the night before. The collection was unexpected. Histories, mostly, some legal texts, a handful of philosophy, and one shelf of what appeared to be older manuscripts in a script she recognized as the Old Tongue, but couldn't read fluently. She mentioned this. "I can read it," he said without inflection. "Can you?" She ran her fingers along the spines. "Where did you learn?" A pause. the texture of which she was beginning to recognize as the particular quality of a man deciding how much to say. "I had an education that covered a lot of ground," he said. She glanced at him. He was mending something, a piece of harness, she thought. Though she wasn't sure where a horse would be kept in a cabin this size. And not quite looking at her. His hands were careful, large, scarred across the knuckles in a pattern that suggested they'd been broken and healed before, but careful. "Were you pack?" she said. Not aggressive, genuinely curious, his hands stilled just briefly. "Yes," he said. "High-ranking." It was a guess, but the books, the cabin's quality, the stillness, the particular way authority, sat in a man who'd had it long enough that it had stopped needing to announce itself. These things added up. He looked at her then, fully, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Something that might have been amusement, or might have been recognition, or was perhaps both. "You're good at that," he said. "At what?" "Reading people without appearing to." She considered whether to be embarrassed, decided against it. "I was married to a pack king," she said. "I learned to read the room or get managed by it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, setting down the harness, "I was Alpha," he said, "of the Greywood Coalition before it dissolved. Before I came here." She absorbed this without reacting, which was itself a kind of reaction, because he had told her something real, and she was treating it with the seriousness it deserved. "And now? Now I'm someone who lives in a cabin and splits wood," he said. There was no bitterness in it. Something more complicated than bitterness. A settled, deliberate peace that had cost a great deal to achieve. "What happened to the coalition?" "Politics," he said. "The council annexation campaign. We were small enough to pressure and too principled to cooperate, which is a position that has a known outcome." He paused. "We dissolved to protect the individual packs. The alternative was to be absorbed and stripped of their customs." She thought of the Aldenmark Council, of the particular way council rooms smelled. Formal power and fear compounded. The copper undertone of wolves, who had learned to be afraid of the men at the table, even when they were among them. "The Aldenmark Council," she said carefully. "Were they involved?" He looked at her, and the amber of his eyes shifted in a way she was beginning to understand as the movement that preceded something honest. "Yes," he said. The bond pulled, low and deep, between her sternum and the space between his chair and hers. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. But she saw in the slight careful quality of his stillness that he felt it too, and that he was choosing, deliberately, not to use it. That was, she thought, the most revealing thing she had learned about him. She was not supposed to find him trustworthy. She had fled one alpha king and arrived in the living space of another, and the rational position was wariness. She maintained the wariness. She simply began building it on a foundation that accounted for the fact that he had told her about the coalition without being asked, had mentioned the Aldenmark Council without political maneuvering, and had not once, in an entire day of proximity, attempted to use the bond pull as leverage or commentary, or even gentle suggestion. That night she ate at his table again, and they talked about the histories on his shelves. She had been reading a specific text about the formation of the territorial system, and she had questions, and he had answers that were too precise to be secondhand, and somewhere in the third hour of it she realized they had stopped being careful with each other. In a particular way, the careful of two people preserving distance, and had shifted without deciding to into something more like a conversation between equals. She noticed it. She didn't stop it. She adjusted her wariness to account for the change. She dreamed that night, and she did not remember what the dream contained, only that she woke from it, with the bond feeling different, less like a wound and more like a direction. By the second morning, she had begun to understand something about Evander that she hadn't let herself understand initially. He was lonely in the specific, controlled way of someone who had chosen solitude, deliberately, but had not entirely made peace with the choosing. He was not miserable, he was not even unhappy exactly, he was lived with, she decided, thoroughly inhabited by himself in a way most people weren't. Because most people needed their reflection in others to know they existed. He had learned to exist without the reflection, but she could see in the way he spoke when she asked him direct questions. In the way the cabin had become slightly less spare since she'd arrived. A second cup on the table, the fire built up without being asked, that the company mattered to him, carefully, in a way he was not going to announce. She was on the third day of something she had decided was not extended shelter accepting, but rather an informal alliance when she found the journal. She was not snooping. She was reaching for a reference text he'd mentioned the previous evening. Something about the original territorial charters. And the journal was behind it, not hidden, simply stored with the reference quality of a document, rather than the private quality of a diary. It was old. The binding was cracked, the pages soft with handling, and when she picked it up, it fell open to a page near the middle, and she saw at the top a seal she recognized. It was the Greywood Coalition seal. She knew it because she had seen it in the Aldenmark Council records. Specifically in the annexation file she'd been shown by the council liaison during her orientation, which had been framed as a historical document, the dissolution of a minor coalition. Nothing significant. The seal was pressed in worn ink and showed a wolf's profile inside a ring of pine boughs, and below the seal was a signature. The signature read Evander Calloway, Alpha Prime, Greywood Coalition. She stood very still with the journal in her hands. Alpha Prime was not the same as Alpha. Alpha Prime was the highest order designation in the old coalition system, not just the leader of one pack, but the designated authority over a grouping of packs, a role that had no precise equivalent in the current council-dominated structure, because the council had systematically dismantled the coalition system to prevent exactly the kind of unified regional authority that an Alpha Prime represented. The Aldenmark Council had spent the better part of a decade working to ensure that no Alpha Prime would emerge again. The annexation file she'd been shown had mentioned the dissolution of the Greywood Coalition as a minor voluntary event. It had not mentioned the Alpha Prime. It had not mentioned what had been asked of him in exchange for that voluntary dissolution, or what the alternative had been. She put the journal down, picked it up, put it down again. He was outside. She could hear him. She realized, already mapped the sounds of him with the precision she applied to things she needed to track. And this was not a thought she could be comfortable with right now. She thought about what she had heard, through an oak-paneled door, 3 weeks and 4 days ago. Her husband's measured voice, "She isn't fit for what's coming." The council agreeing, the phrase, "provisional bonding period." She thought about the Aldenmark Council's role in the Greywood Coalition dissolution. She thought about the annexation campaign, and the specific timing of her marriage treaty, and the fact that the council had taken a sudden interest in the Western Reaches in the same period that the coalition had been dissolved, which meant the Alpha Prime of that coalition had been defanged and removed to a cabin in the unclaimed territory, and the Western Reaches had been made available for the kind of treaty that produced political marriages. She thought about what it meant that the bond she felt toward Evander, the true bond, the bone-deep, fated mate recognition she hadn't felt in 3 weeks of marriage to Callum, despite every official ceremony, had been there from the moment the air had shifted between them in the dark Greywood forest. The door opened. He came inside with firewood, which he set by the hearth without looking at her, immediately. And then he turned and looked at her and saw whatever was in her face, and went still. "The journal," she said. He looked at it on the table where she'd left it. He looked at her. Something resolved in his expression. Not relief, exactly, but the particular quality of a man who had been holding something and was allowing himself to put it down. "Yes," he said. "Alpha Prime," she said. "Not just Alpha." "Yes. The council annexation campaign removed me," he said simply, without melodrama, which was somehow worse than melodrama would have been. "They couldn't depose me outright. The coalition protocols don't allow external deposition. So they pressured the smaller packs individually, used resource leverage and security threats to create the conditions in which dissolution was the only way to protect them. I signed the dissolution agreement in exchange for immunity for the individual pack territories." She sat down, not because she was overcome, but because she was thinking very hard. And thinking was easier when she wasn't allocating energy to standing. What did they get in exchange for dissolving the coalition? He sat down across from her, not crowding her. The amber eyes were steady, watching her process. "Western Passage rights," he said, "and a precedent. That the Alpha Prime designation was defunct, which cleared the way for the Council's authority to be the only authority in this region." "Which cleared the way," she said slowly, "for treaty marriages with the Western Reaches." Silence. "With me," she said. "Cleared the way for my marriage to Callum." "I didn't know about you specifically," he said, and his voice had a careful quality she recognized as the sound of a man being precise about the truth. "I knew the trajectory. I didn't know the individuals. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire cracked. Outside, the grey wood was entirely itself, enormous and indifferent, which she found oddly comforting. The council told Callum to replace me, she said. That's what I heard, not Callum deciding. The council directing. She could hear it now, with the new information. The phrasing, the legalistic language. The way Callum had spoken with the voice he used when he was announcing decisions that had already been made by other people. She had heard it as betrayal. She had not heard it as coercion. He was going to do it anyway, she said. Whatever his reasons, he didn't tell me. No, Evander said, but the council, she stopped. The thing she was feeling was not forgiveness of Callum. It was something more structural than that. An understanding of the architecture she'd been placed into. The specific design of it. And who had designed it. The same council that destroyed your coalition, she said. Arranged my marriage. And is now arranging my replacement. Because I'm not, she thought of the phrase from the corridor. Not fit for what's coming. What is coming? He looked at her for a moment, then. The council has been moving toward formalizing its authority across all remaining territories. The last two things that could meaningfully oppose that are the Alpha Prime designation, which they believe they've eliminated, and a mate bond that supersedes political marriage. He said the last part carefully, watching her. She looked at him. The bond between them was doing nothing as subtle now. It had given up subtlety entirely. It was a directional certainty, the same quality as the compass in her bag, pointing to something that was north of everything else. A mate bond that supersedes political marriage, she repeated. Yes, which is what the fated mate bond does, she said. Legally in the old charter system, yes. If the Alpha Prime designation were to be reinstated, is that possible? If the conditions that caused the dissolution can be documented and challenged, he said. If the coercion can be proven, the protocols allow for challenge on those grounds. It would require testimony from someone with access to the council's records. He paused. Someone who had been inside the council structures. She thought of the council files she'd been shown during her orientation, the annexation file, framed as minor history. She thought of the treaty documents she'd signed, which she'd read very carefully, because she always read things carefully, and which had contained specific language she'd found unusual at the time. Language that referenced territorial rights and precedent setting in ways that had seemed more complex than a straightforward marriage treaty required. I kept copies, she said, of the treaty documents. The originals are in the castle, but I made copies of the relevant sections during the first week. He was very still. Where? She looked at him steadily. The woman who had learned to read rooms, to map exits, to make copies of documents she wasn't sure she'd need, to keep her mother's compass and her practical clothing at the bottom of the wardrobe, to request freedom of movement in writing as the non-negotiable term of an arrangement that had been designed around her invisibility. In my bag, she said. I brought them because I always bring things I might need. He held her gaze, and the amber of his eyes was doing the thing she'd catalogued on the first night. The deeper thing, the older thing. That was not just color but something more fundamental. Recognition moving through it like light through water. She stood. She went to her bag. She took out the folded documents she'd copied in her careful handwriting on plain paper during the first week of her marriage, which she'd packed at the bottom with her mother's compass without entirely knowing why, and she laid them on the table between them. He looked at the documents, then at her. Something in his face was doing what faces did when people reached the end of the distance they had been keeping. Sarah, he said. I know, she said. She was not talking about the documents. He was quiet for a moment that had a quality she had not encountered in any room with any person before. A mutual recognition of the thing that had been there since the dark forest and the moonlight, and the question about where she was going. I'm not asking you to stay, he said. I need you to know that. I know that too, she said. What happened to you? The treaty, the marriage, the way they used you, is connected to what happened to you, she said. Yes, I've worked that out. She sat back down, not away from him. At the same level, across the same table, with the documents between them, which was where she thought the important things should be. Between people, not directed at them. The council built a system where we would both lose. You lose your coalition. I lose my standing in a marriage designed to be temporary. They get the territory and the precedent, and no one who can coherently oppose them. She paused. It's a very clean design. Yes, he said. But it depends on us not finding each other, she said. It depends on the Alpha Prime in his cabin and the displaced Western Reach's wife in her castle, never being in the same room. He looked at the documents on the table. I had found other evidence, he said slowly, but it was insufficient alone. Without the treaty language, without the through line between my dissolution and your placement. They're connected, she said. The treaty references the Greywood Coalition dissolution directly. I noticed it the first time I read it. I didn't understand what it meant. And now I understand what it means. She looked at him carefully. What happens when you challenge the dissolution, if you succeed? The Alpha Prime designation reinstates, he said. The coalition territories become subject to the original charter protections, which means the Council's annexation authority over them is void. And the fated mate bond? A pause. He was being careful with this, she realized, in the specific way of a man who understood that the bond was not an argument he was entitled to make, who knew, down to the marrow, that a pull was not a choice, and that one did not do the other one, the indignity of conflating them. Supersedes political marriage in the old charter, he said, if the bonded pair choose to recognize it. He added the last part, with the same precision he'd brought to everything real he'd told her. It was the necessary truth, and he would not soften it by leaving it out. If she heard that word and respected him for it enormously. She looked at the documents. She looked at him. She thought about the corridor outside the council chamber, the silver tray handles biting into her palms, the way Hope left without announcing it was going. She thought about the cabin, the large boots, the coffee made by someone who took coffee seriously, the way he'd told her about the Alpha Prime designation without waiting for her to ask, the way he had sat across a fire from her for 3 nights, and not once attempted to use the bond that she knew. From his eyes, from his stillness, he felt as clearly as she did. I want to understand something, she said. The challenge, documenting the coercion, challenging the dissolution. What does that require? A formal hearing before the Elder Assembly, he said, not the Council. The Elder Assembly is a separate body, older than the Council, and it still has jurisdiction over Alpha Prime designations. The Council has been hoping they'd simply never have occasion to convene it. The Elder Assembly, she said. Where is it convened? Thornwick, he said. The northern settlement, where you were trying to go. She absorbed this. She thought about coincidence, and about the shape that things sometimes took when they were not, in fact, coincidental. About a woman walking north in court, shoes with a compass, and a bag of documents she'd kept without fully knowing why. And a man in a cabin who had been sitting on insufficient evidence for 4 years waiting for the thing that would make it enough. I was going to Thornwick, she said, because my sister is there. She's been there for 2 years. She wrote me a letter. She paused. My sister is Mira Bramblefield. Evander went still in a way he hadn't gone still before. Mira Bramblefield, he said, the Elder Assembly's record keeper. Yes, Sarah said. I didn't know what that meant when she wrote to me. I knew she'd taken a post she was proud of. I didn't know the assembly was. She stopped, breathed. The compass in her bag was pointing to something so much more specific than north, that it almost made her laugh. And she was choosing not to laugh, because the moment felt like it required steadiness. How long has the coalition evidence been sitting at insufficient, she said. 4 years, he said quietly. 4 years, she repeated. And when did the council begin pressuring Callum to place a Western Reaches woman in a provisional bond? He did not answer immediately. She could see him doing the same calculation she was doing. 3 years ago, he said. Approximately. They knew Mira was there, Sarah said. They couldn't remove her because the Elder Assembly appointment is protected. But they could put me in a place that kept me away from her. Kept the treaty documents away from Thornwick. Kept the through line from ever being drawn. She looked at the documents on the table, at the specific language she had copied in her careful handwriting, the reference to the Greywood Coalition dissolution, that connected the arranged marriage, to the dismantled coalition, to the suppressed Alpha Prime. The provisional bond was designed to be replaced after the treaty served its purpose, before I could understand what I'd witnessed. Yes, he said. His voice was very quiet. And instead I heard Callum tell his council I was going to be replaced, she said. And I left, and walked north, and arrived in your forest. They sat with that for a moment. The design they built, she said, required that I be passive, that I sit in the castle and not read the treaty carefully, and not keep copies, and not remember the details, and not walk out and not find you. She looked at the documents. At the journal, still sitting where she'd placed it, the coalition seal visible on the open page. They built a very clean design, she said again. For the kind of person I'm not. Something moved across his face then. Something that was not quite a smile and not quite not a smile. Something warmer and more specific. And the bond between them was not pulling anymore. It had stopped pulling. It had simply arrived. The way a tide arrived. Not striving toward the shore, but simply there. Filling every available space without force or argument. The natural consequence of two things that had always been meant to occupy the same space, finally doing so. The ridge road to Thornwick, she said. How long? 2 days, he said. If we leave at first light. She heard the we and did not correct it. Then we should sleep, she said. There's a lot to do when we get there. They left before first light, in fact, because Sarah woke in the dark hours to the particular quiet that meant the rain had stopped and the air had shifted. And she rose and dressed, and came out to find him already at the table with a pack assembled and the fire banked. He looked up when she came in and didn't ask if she was ready. Because she was visibly ready, and he was not the kind of man who asked questions the answer to which was apparent. They went out into the greywood in the blue dark before dawn, both of them carrying packs, Sarah in the large laced boots that had stopped feeling foreign sometime in the night. The bond between them now, something so settled and present, that it was no longer an acute experience, but simply a quality of the air between them, reliable and permanent as cedar wood and deep water. The ridge road was exactly as he'd described it, a full day longer than the direct route, staying within the greywood's enormous pines, climbing gradually to the ridge where the trees thinned and the sky opened, and she could see, from the height of it, the full scope of the unclaimed territory spreading south and east, the suggestion of mountains to the north, and beyond the mountains, distant and specific, the settlement of Thornwick catching the early light. They stopped on the ridge as the sun came fully up. She stood with the compass open in her palm, though she didn't need it. Direction was obvious. And looked at what was ahead and what was behind in the same moment that she let herself look at him, standing beside her with the morning light making his face something she had not expected. Younger, somehow, than the cabin had suggested. And unguarded in the way that height and open sky sometimes unguarded people. When you told me your name, she said, that first night, just a wander out here. Yes, he said. Were you testing something? He considered this honestly. I was giving you the choice, he said, of what you were agreeing to when you agreed to shelter. I didn't want you to make the decision based on the title. She thought about this. Because you thought I might make it differently. Because I thought you deserved to make it on your own terms, he said, not based on what I'd been or what I might be again. On who you found in the cabin. She closed the compass, put it in her coat pocket. For the record, she said, who you found in the cabin is not negligible. The corner of his mouth moved. The shadow of the smile she'd been seeing since the first night, which she now understood was what his smiles actually looked like. Contained, specific, offered to particular things and not as currency. Neither is who I found in the forest, he said. They were quiet for a moment on the ridge with the morning around them. The elder assembly hearing, she said. My testimony, the documents, your evidence. What are the odds? Higher than they were 4 days ago, he said. And if it works, she said carefully, the coalition reinstates. The council's annexation authority is void. Your designation is restored. Yes, Alpha Prime is a significant role, she said. Not a cabin in chopped wood kind of role. No, he said. It isn't. I'm not going back to Aldenmark, she said. Not as a statement about him. As a clarification for herself, said aloud to verify the truth of it, which it was. Regardless of what happens, I'm not provisionally anything to anyone again. No, he said. Not as an agreement about her future specifically. As a statement that the word provisional, in this context, did not apply. She looked at him steadily. The bond, she said. What it means in the charter system. If the designation reinstates and the bond is recognized. What does that mean for me, specifically? What role does it create? He met her gaze without deflection. In the original coalition structure, he said, the Alpha Prime's bonded mate held a co-primary designation, not ceremonial, functional. The bond is recognized as a dual authority. She absorbed this. Dual authority, she said. Not consort, not wife of, not political placement, not any of those things, he said. A recognized power in the structure. Equal standing before the elder assembly. She thought about the Aldenmark council chamber, the tray in her hands, the measured voice through the door. the word replacement. She thought about what it meant to be built into a system as an object, and what it meant to be named a power within one. She thought about the specific quality of the wording he'd used. Not promising, not performing. Simply stating the structural truth with the precision of a man who had refused, in 4 years of cabin and wood chopping, to become dishonest about what things were. I need you to understand something, she said. Yes, he said, waiting. I'm going to Thornwick to see my sister, she said, and to give testimony before the Elder Assembly, and to help document what the council did. I'm doing those things because they are the right things, and because I have the means to do them. Not because of the bond. Not because of what it creates legally. If the hearing succeeds and the designation reinstates, and the bond is recognized, I'll be choosing that, on my terms, in full knowledge of what I'm choosing. She paused. I need that to be understood. He was quiet for a moment. The amber eyes were steady and warm and fully present. I know that, he said. I've known that since you told me you weren't going back, regardless of any explanation. A pause. I wouldn't want it any other way. She believed him. It was the most significant thing she had believed in recent memory, and she held it carefully, the way she held the compass, as an instrument that pointed true, that could be trusted, that had been made with more integrity than the things that surrounded it. All right, she said. She looked north toward Thornwick. Then let's go. Thornwick was a northern settlement of some size, stone-built and serious, its streets laid out with the no-nonsense practicality of a community that had survived several hard winters by virtue of being well organized. The Elder Assembly Hall was the largest structure in it, old enough that its stones had darkened to near black with age, and its entrance was flanked by the original coalition seals. 12 of them, one for each founding coalition, preserved in iron relief on the outer wall. The graywood seal was there, the wolf inside the ring of pines. Sarah looked at it as they walked past, and then looked at Evander walking beside her, and something clicked into place with the finality of a lock finding its key. Mira was at the door before they reached it, which meant someone had seen them coming, which meant Mira had been watching, which meant Mira had been expecting something. And when Sarah saw her sister's face, the face she had not seen in 2 years, she understood that Mira had not simply taken a record-keeper post in Thornwick, because it was a proud appointment. I wrote you that letter 6 months ago, Mira said, without preamble, pulling Sarah into an embrace that she returned fully for the first time in longer than she could account for. I didn't know if you'd come, or if you'd come with. She looked over Sarah's shoulder at Evander, and the look on her face was not surprise. Alpha Prime, she said, a title, used with the precision of someone who managed titles for a living. Not yet, Evander said. Not yet, Mira agreed, and smiled the way Sarah remembered her smiling, privately specifically, at outcomes she'd been tracking for some time. The assembly can convene in 48 hours if the petition is filed today. She looked at Sarah. Do you have the documents? Sarah reached into her pack. She set the copied pages on the stone step between them, the treaty language, the Greywood Coalition reference, the through line that connected the annexation to the arranged marriage, to the suppressed Alpha Prime designation in a chain of deliberate causation. Mira looked at the documents for a long moment, something clarifying in her face like weather moving off. Then she looked up. They're going to oppose this, Mirasa said. Yes, Sarah said, the council has agents even here. Not within the assembly, but proximate. They'll try to delay, to discredit. Let them try, Sarah said. Mira looked at her for a moment. Her younger sister, who had been sent west on a treaty, who had stood in a corridor with a silver tray, and heard herself described as responsible, who had walked north in court shoes, with a compass and a careful handwriting and a bag of documents kept against necessity, who had found, in an unclaimed forest, the precise person the councils had spent 4 years ensuring she would not find. When did you become like this? Mira said. Sarah thought about it. I think I always was, she said. I was just in rooms that required me to be smaller than it. The Elder Assembly convened 36 hours later, which was 12 hours ahead of the minimum, and which said something about the Elder Assembly's patience with a council that had spent years attempting to make itself the only relevant authority in the region. The hall was full. Not performatively full, not the choreographed fullness of a court session, but the dense, serious fullness of people who had been waiting for this specific convening and had come because it mattered to them personally. Sarah gave her testimony in the direct, clear way she did everything. without drama, with specificity, with the documents laid on the assembly table as she walked through each connection. She was not nervous. She recognized, doing the thing she had always been most precisely made for, reading a room that required competence, and giving it competence, without performance, without apology, and without anyone to refer to for permission. The treaty language she'd copied was entered into the record. The timeline she had reconstructed was entered into the record. The chain of causation, coalition dissolution, Western Territory annexation, provisional marriage, planned replacement, was articulated, documented, and entered into the record. When she finished, there was a silence in the hall, of the kind that follows something that has named what was previously unnameable. Evander's testimony followed, and then Mira's archival evidence, and then the formal petition for reinstatement of the Alpha Prime designation on the grounds of coerced dissolution. The deliberation took 4 hours. She spent them in the antechamber with Evander, neither of them particularly anxious. There was a quality to the waiting that was not the waiting of people uncertain of the outcome, but of people who had done what could be done, and were now allowing the world to do its part. Whatever the outcome, she said at one point. Whatever the outcome, he agreed, not completing the thought, because neither of them needed to. Whatever the outcome, she had left a place she should not have stayed. Whatever the outcome, she had walked north and found what she found. Whatever the outcome, she had given her testimony and laid her documents on the table and spoken truth in a room that required it. And this was not contingent on a legal decision. This was simply who she was. The outcome was reinstatement. She heard it in the quality of the sound that moved through the hall from the inner chamber. Not a cheer, nothing so simple as a cheer, but a collective exhale with a particular texture. The sound of people releasing something they had been holding for a long time. Evander stood when the elder convener entered the antechamber. The convener was a woman of considerable age, with the kind of face that had finished with performing anything, and was simply itself. She looked at Evander and then at Sarah, with the evaluating, unhurried gaze of someone who had spent a career reading pairs of people and their bond. Alpha Prime Calloway, she said. The designation is reinstated. The dissolution is voided on grounds of coercion. The Council's annexation authority over the Greywood territories is void. She paused. The Assembly also finds, on review of the testimony and documentation, that the treaty marriage was constructed under fraudulent pretenses and is thereby legally dissolved, effective immediately. Sarah absorbed this. The pressure in her chest. The thing she had been living beside for weeks. The ache of a bond pulling toward something it hadn't been allowed to reach. Resolved, quietly, completely, into something else. Not absence, something warmer and more permanent. A settled, specific truth, the way the compass pointed true. The convener looked at her directly. "You are not a provisional anything," the woman said, and the precision of it made Sarah think Mira might have had a word with her in advance, which would be entirely like Mira. The Assembly recognizes the fated mate bond, if both parties choose to do so formally, as superseding all prior political arrangements and establishing co-primary status within the reinstated coalition structure. She looked at Evander. He was looking at her. The amber of his eyes was doing the deep, older thing, the thing that was recognition and not performance, that had been there since the moonlit forest and the question about where she was going. "Your terms," he said quietly, just for her. "On your terms." She thought about the woman she had been in the Aldenmark castle, reading the room and keeping her exits mapped and copying documents at the bottom of her wardrobe. She thought about the compass in her pocket, and the letter from her sister, and the particular quality of freedom of movement in writing, which had seemed like a small concession to the people who'd granted it, and was in fact the most important thing in the room. She thought about 3 weeks of provisional queenship, and the corridor outside the council chamber, and the silver tray set down without a sound, and the North Road, and the Greywood, and the smell of cedarwood and deep water in the dark. "My terms," she said. In the spring, when the Elder Assembly formally reconvened the Greywood Coalition, and the individual pack territories came back under the original charter protections, and when the Council, stripped of its annexation authority and facing a formal Elder Assembly inquiry into its conduct, found itself for the first time in a decade without the structural power to simply decide what things would be. There was a ceremony in the Thornwick Hall that was attended by representatives from all 12 coalition packs, and by Mira, who had not stopped looking quietly pleased with herself since the hearing, and by the elder convener, and by a great many people who had spent years existing in the gap between what the council said the world was and what they knew it actually was. The ceremony was brief, because Sarah had specified brief and specific, and without the language of ownership or arrangement in any of its formal language, which the convener had accepted without surprise, because the Assembly's original charter language was in fact considerably better on this point than anything the council had been using. She stood beside Evander and made a choice that she had made freely and continued to make freely, which was the only way she knew how to make a choice that meant anything. The bond settled into its final permanent form, bone deep and clear, the way true things were clear, not blinding, not overwhelming, simply true. The cedar wood and deep water scent of him had become, by now, simply the smell of a thing that was hers and that she was. And the fated mate recognition was not an acute feeling anymore, but something she lived inside, as she lived inside her own self, without requiring it to be confirmed or explained. She still had the compass. She still had the letter from her sister. She had, it turned out, needed the documents, and the practical clothes, and the freedom of movement in writing, and the habit of reading things carefully and keeping copies. She had needed the exits mapped, and the north road chosen, and the tray set down without a sound. She had needed to be exactly who she had always been, in a situation specifically designed to prevent that from being enough. It had been enough. It had in fact been precisely enough. The slate came through the high windows of the Thornwick Hall and lay across the old coalition seals on the wall, and Sarah stood in it beside the man who was hers and who she was. And she was not provisional, and she was not replaceable, and she was not smaller than the room required. And when she looked at him and he looked at her, what passed between them was not the pull of a bond, straining toward connection, but the quiet, permanent recognition of two people who had each found the direction they had always been walking in and arrived.